I was going back and forth. So when I would be covering the Heat for a few days, sometimes LeBron would pull me aside and say, "What did Riles say now?" And then when I'd be back in Miami, sometimes UD or Dwayne would pull me aside and say, "What the F is going on in Cleveland?"
Yeah. Ethan Skolnick, welcome to the show, brother. Appreciate you being here.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. I'm a huge fan of yours. I've been listening to you for a long time. So long time listener, first time interviewer.
It's a lot nicer than my studio. Our studio is basically a small kitchen table in my condo on Las Olas on Zoom. So I'm impressed with this.
Oh, thank you, brother. You could, if you want to use it anytime, you're welcome.
I appreciate that.
Awesome, man. Well, I want to get into all that stuff. The big three is definitely stuff that I want to hear your perspective on because, again, I think of that era, 2010 to 2014, and I have such fond memories as a Heat fan, as a lifelong Heat fan. For me, you're like a voice of that era. When I think of that time, like listening to you on 790, right, at the time, and you're reporting for Palm Beach Post. It was great stuff, man. So excited to hear all your perspectives.
Yeah, it was different. I remember 10 years ago today, I had gotten sort of, we were all chasing it, obviously, but at the time I was a columnist for the Sun Sentinel with Dave Hyde, covering all the sports. And, when newspapers could afford 2 columnists, there was a time they could afford 5. Now they can't afford 1, unfortunately. But I was waiting for everything as everyone else was. And so you were looking for, tips anywhere you could get them. Well, one of the tips that I got early in the morning was kind of an easy one, which is that the Sun Sentinel's advertising department had received an inquiry. Basically, they'd received copy already for a big splash full-page ad of the big three. And so
that morning on the 10th.
That morning. So I said, okay, the Heat knows something because they received it from the Heat. And so the Heat knows something. LeBron's coming. And so I kind of tweeted that out. But as the day went on, I was told that the ad was changed, and it was just Chris and Dwayne. And so I got thrown off about an hour before the actual decision. So I thought he was not coming. I thought that this was, at the last minute, I thought this was a head fake, and ultimately he was not going to, although, again, I disagreed with everybody who had problems with the way he did the decision. I think that the problems that everybody had with it, and I talked to Mark Jones from my own podcast about this today, that I think a lot of the problems were about people who don't like player empowerment, and that's where a lot of that came from. And also, people view Miami around the country in a very, I wouldn't say negative light, but they view it as a vacation spot that did not deserve LeBron James. And so I think that that's where a lot of the vitriol came from, and that's why he dealt with it as much as he had to deal with it. I remember being there that night covering it for the Sun Sentinel, and one of my best friends in the business, but just generally, is George Sedano, and I was there with George, and we were watching it, and I looked at him and I said, I need to cover this all the time. Because at the time I was also doing Dolphins and Marlins and everything else. I need to cover this all the time. And it just so happened that week that I had worked at the Palm Beach Post before, and they decided they had gotten rid of their Heat coverage. After I left, they covered it for another couple of years with a good friend of mine, Chris Perkins, and then they basically got rid of their coverage. And I got a call saying, we're bringing our coverage back. Do you know anybody who'd want to do it? And I said, well, this person says, what about you? I'm like, okay, I'll do it.
This is at the Palm Beach Post?
At the Palm Beach Post. And that's why I went back to the Post to be their Heat columnist, because it's just, you just realize that this story, I mean, as opposed to, covering the Dolphins going 7-9 every year.
Right.
This story was so much bigger than just basketball.
Historic, yeah.
It is. And I made the argument today on Twitter that the Golden State Warriors had the best team post-Jordan. I don't think anybody can really argue with that. I mean, when you put Durant on a team that had already won 73 games, you can't argue with that. I think that the Spurs have had the most consistent organization, but the Miami Heat had the most impactful era. I think when you look at it in terms of beyond just the basketball, and there was a lot of basketball. I mean, in terms of unlocking LeBron as a 4, the positionless, the different lineups that Eric used. But I think, and that 12-13 team is one of the great teams of all time, the 27-game winning streak team. But I think that it's really more about what they meant beyond basketball. They are the first super team of the social media era. The first super team of the past 15, 20 years was the Celtics. But Twitter really came into form in 2009.
Right.
And so you had this convergence of the biggest sports star in the world making a historic decision to come play in paradise while social media was exploding. I don't think you'll ever have it again. And then that team, LeBron found his voice on that team, not just in terms of his basketball voice, but also in terms of his social justice and everything else. A lot of that spurred by Dwayne and other guys on that team. And so you saw the Trayvon Martin hoodies. You saw, then the fun stuff, which was, the Harlem Shake. And then also, media, which I thought sports media acted at its worst, particularly early on in that, particularly, us making celebrities of hacks like Skip Bayless and Colin Cowherd and Jason Whitlock and others. But then to have, someone like Dan, Le Batard, who's been a mentor of mine for a long time, being sort of the voice of Miami and pushing back, and the us against the world, the gates, the Crygate, Bumpgate, all of the different gates. The December 2nd, 2010 in Cleveland, where I feared for my life after the third quarter, decided we all retreated because the batteries were being thrown. The night before LeBron went back to Cleveland, I was at a sports bar down the street from Quicken Loans. And when you went into the bathroom, they had, the urinal cakes were LeBron's mouth open. So you were basically, urinating into LeBron's mouth.
Crazy.
And down the street, they had another one where the best LeBron joke got you, a shot for 25 cents. That will not be replicated. I really don't think all of those things coming together, and then the way that it played out, which had this kind of natural arc, which was, you get there, but you fail, and the protagonist is the one that causes the failure. Because I still believe, and we've had so many people on the pod to try to explain it, and I was there at the time, but to try to explain what happened to LeBron in the 11 finals. But I really think emotionally he just crashed.
He was tired, man.
He was tired. And, the question that he was asked of Greg Doyle, I always remember, during the finals, why do you keep shrinking in the fourth quarter? And LeBron could not stop talking about that question. It just was... And so I think all of those things, and then LeBron failing, and then at the end you can all go back to your lives now, which is really his only public misstep in that entire period.
Yeah.
And then, getting back in the lab, coming back, and that next season and beating Dallas, after the lockout on Christmas, and that team, as Shane Battier told me on the pod, like being on a mission like you never seen. And then you have, this moment, it's about time and all the rest. And then having the peak of it, which is the greatness of the 12-13 season. And then the natural, downfall that most mini dynasties encounter, which is we got tired of each other.
Right.
And, LeBron, Dwayne telling me, that year was not fun, and they just didn't enjoy each other anymore. They didn't enjoy the process. And it was really, I think Pat will acknowledge it in the future, but I think it really was time. To go, I know he wanted them all to be at each other's barbecues for the next 15 years, and they should have been, but I think also the organization made some mistakes that they'd like to take back, and they also, I think, misjudged LeBron's desire to kind of win over and over. His desires really turned a little bit more towards getting the one for home.
Yeah, definitely.
And prioritizing that.
Once you win back-to-back in Miami, it feels like he's like, okay, I got the playbook now. I can understand now how to replicate this back where I come from. And I don't blame him one bit. I mean, obviously, as a Heat fan, I was upset that it happened in 2014 and he went back. But you look at the book that he's going to write when this is all said and done, and that's a great chapter. You want that chapter.
It is, and he was right, ultimately. They made a calculation, not just him, but his team. And by his team, I talk about Maverick and Rich and Randy Mims and all the rest of them. They made a calculation that winning one in Cleveland would be of more significance than winning a third in Miami.
Yep.
And LeBron does make these calculations. I remember I had a conversation with him that got a little attention. I think it was after his first championship here. And I asked him, we were in Phoenix, and I had a moment alone with him, and I said, it was around the time Durant was in his 7th season with OKC. It was right before All-Star. So I was working on a piece about why KD didn't get the same heat that LeBron got. It was before KD went to Golden State and made his own calculation. And LeBron looked at me and he goes, well, he says, people care more about me winning my third than him winning his first. And he didn't mean it in an arrogant way. He meant it as it was always going to be about him first, as long as he was playing. And they made a calculation then, in 2014. There were a lot of other factors. There were personal factors. There were some factors inside the organization. There was a lot of unhappiness that last season here. I've been told that, everybody makes a big deal of the Mike Miller decision, but I've been told that the Heat would do it differently again, but not so much because they expected Mike to play so well that last year in Memphis before his body broke down, but because there were other guys who came back for that last year who they could have parted with instead, who were less into it.
Right.
And I think you can probably figure out who some of those guys were. They were the guys who were unhappy that last year. But I think when you look at the calculation LeBron made, it was, okay, I can go back up there. I can do what is perceived by the national media as the right thing because nobody liked my decision to go to Miami in the first place.
Yep.
I can be the conquering hero, and if I win one, and he was right, because when people talk about him from a legacy perspective, they talk more about the 2016 championship in Cleveland
Right.
than they talk about the championships in Miami. So he was correct, and I think if you look at the way he's kind of plotted out his career, it is played out pretty much as you would want. Because, again, in Cleveland, he did what he had to do.
Right.
And then it was time to embrace a new challenge, which was, in his view, he won't say it now, but in a lot of ways, he used to compare himself to Kobe a lot. I had a lot of those conversations with him. And I think there became this love between him and Kobe, but at the time, there was more of a rivalry feeling from him. Mm-hmm. And I think going out to L.A. and kind of not supplanting Magic, because there's a different relationship there, but the supplanting Kobe as the guy in LA, I think did appeal to him.
Yeah.
And then obviously from a family perspective and a movie perspective and Space Jam and everything, he wanted to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like you talked about, again, all of the hate that LeBron got for leaving Cleveland, blue collar town, not a lot of, national recognition for going to that city as a destination, to leave to Miami, this kind of,
right.
Hedonistic city that's really exciting that everybody wants to be at. I think spurned obviously Cleveland, but then he came back, he won the championship, then go to what is essentially the Miami of the West, Los Angeles. Right. Now they're like, we understand, LeBron.
They understand, but it's partially that, but it's also that ESPN dictates the conversation and the narrative, and ESPN had already decided to move basically its whole NBA apparatus out to Los Angeles.
Yep.
So it's kind of like worked out the best for them. I mean, one of the conversations I had with Mark Jones about Miami is, Mark's lived for 30 years. He lives in Weston now, but he's lived in this market for 30 years. And we always joke about the idea that, in Miami, he's calling a Canes game at the stadium, which is across from a Walmart and a racetrack, and not a real racetrack, but a racetrack gas station. And yet the overhead shots are of South Beach.
Right.
And it's like, I mean, you cannot have two places more different than Miami Gardens and South Beach.
Right.
But I think people nationally, they like to put that up there as sort of what we are, but then it works against us when you say, are we deserving of this? Well, you don't deserve this. I mean, I can tell you, yes, people in Cleveland deserve more, because I lived in Cleveland basically for a year, and it's hell. And so if you want, I can understand why there would be a feeling, okay, we deserve a little bit more. But there, what I never liked about the idea, and you use the phrase, and I don't know you mean it this way, but this got put to me on the radio all the time, blue collar in Cleveland. And I think the connotation of that, unfortunately, is white. I feel like that, when it gets pushed out there as Cleveland is blue collar, it's like as if people in Miami aren't struggling to put food on the table, and the area, literally walking distance from the arena, is poorer than any area in downtown Cleveland.
Right.
So I think that perception got pushed out there, and it was all glitz, glamour. And the other thing about it that's interesting is the Heat organization, not the Cavs organization, is the one that was the hard work organization. The culture organization. I was in Cleveland because Bleacher Report sent me against the terms of my contract in 2014 after my child was born. And I was in Cleveland for a year. I spent 130 nights with the Cavs. Not all in Cleveland, thankfully, but more than half of them. And, I think when you look, I mean, that was the perception of it, again, that it was, this was the blue collar place. But then I would go to cover Cavs, games Cavs practices. They were totally disorganized. Nobody was running the ship. I mean, I developed relationships with people. I have great respect for David Griffin. I think he got it under control there. But when he took over, David Blatt was the coach, and they'd had this legacy of failure and all the rest of it. I mean, there was no comparison. I mean, LeBron started quoting Spoelstra all the time because it was like he was looking for something to hold on to from Miami. Like you said, he wanted to build the culture from Miami in Cleveland, which is why he brought James Jones, why he brought Mike Miller. He assigned Mike Miller to Kyrie. They became very close. I mean, Mike had Kyrie at his house all the time because it was like, you're going to teach him how to be a pro. And, and then Skull comes back to the Heat, but, the 2 months into it, he'd had enough of Dion.
Right.
and I was in Philly the night that Dion was traded. I was with the Cavs, and I was told this is addition by subtraction. And this was basically, Cleveland, LeBron trying to clean out the Cavs mess and build Miami Heat North. And he took all of that from Pat Riley and Eric Spoelstra. Yeah. And he knows it now. At the time, he was resistant. When I was going back and forth. So when I would be covering the Heat for a few days, sometimes LeBron would pull me aside and say, "What did Riles say now?" And then when I'd be back in Miami, sometimes UD or Dwayne would pull me aside and say, "What the F is going on in Cleveland?" Yeah. So it was kind of funny when Dwayne ended up there because I never thought that would happen.
That is crazy. So like going back to those days, I mean, what are some of the stories that really stick out to you? Like your favorite moments and stories that you covered during that LeBron Heat era?
Well, there are so many, and some are basketball and some are not basketball. I mean, the general stuff was just the places we would go on the road, and people would be lined up at the hotel, even though the hotel wasn't published. Now, it's a small list. I mean, they stay at Four Seasons, and
right,
but they would be at the hotel. And I remember in Charlotte one time, places you wouldn't expect, like Charlotte, they would be backed up all the way. There's that kind of epicenter in Charlotte with, the restaurants, and it's really the only place to go. But the Four Seasons, it was either the Ritz or the Ritz that they stay at, I think. And it was just a long, long line of people waiting for them. And that happened at all the practice facilities that we went to. I just think that it was a show. I mean, one of the things that...
The Heatles, right?
The Heatles. Yeah. I kind of invented that, but I don't get credit for it. I wrote it in a column, and LeBron was using it the next day, and I was like, okay, that one's gone.
That's awesome.
I didn't invent Big Three and Little 12 though. That was UD. But I think that when you look at all the moments, I mean, some are basketball and some are not. I think that the basketball moments and the stuff that first year was really the most compelling because we were going to places that, like, there was no chance LeBron would ever entertain going to as a free agent.
Right.
Memphis, Portland, Phoenix. Cleveland's another story, but Indiana. And yet the vitriol would be incredible from jump, and he was so uncomfortable with it. Sure. If you remember the way LeBron came into the league, he was a puppet. And I don't mean a puppet like taking orders. He was literally a puppet. I mean, him and Kobe were puppets in those ads.
Yep.
Like he had this he was perceived as the more, as opposed to Kobe, who, had this kind of gruff personality at that point and was kind of trying to be Jordan. And, LeBron was perceived as the more accessible, the smiling one. And it all flipped in like one decision.
Right.
And he was not comfortable with it. That's why I say I think this all bled to what happened. But there were so many of the other moments. I mean, think about some of the ridiculous stuff that happened. I mean, Crygate. They lose 5 straight at home during that first year, which was unfathomable. And people thought they were going to win 75 games.
Sure.
And they lose to Chicago, a team they didn't like to lose to, during what turned out to be Rose's MVP year, which pissed LeBron off. Also pissed LeBron off that I voted for Rose, which is a vote I would take back. And they were, everybody's, Spo was on such a spot all the time. So he makes, one comment about the guys, were crying in the locker room, and he meant it as they were being passionate.
Right, exactly.
There were 3 guys who teared up during the locker room. LeBron was one of them. Okay. But it wasn't like weeping in the corner, but this became like a 4-day story. Like, I mean, it
was like Bumpgate. Remember that?
Well, Bumpgate. I was in Dallas for that one. That is the night. That's probably, other than December 2nd, 2010 in Cleveland, that's probably the most memorable regular season night that they ever had. Bumpgate was. We used to sit courtside everywhere. That doesn't happen anymore. We don't even know if we'll be in an arena again with COVID. But we used to sit courtside, and so you could see it melting down in Dallas. That was a game they dropped to 9-8. They were not communicating. Nobody knew where to go. Right. They were all yelling at Rio. Everything was just kind of falling apart. Poor Rio. Poor the GOAT. Right. They were all yelling at Rio. They were all pissed off. And so they lose. And then, typically, I was on these really tight deadlines with the Palm Beach Post. So typically the deal was you get done And that first year, they were bringing Dwayne and LeBron. They did it with Bosh, and then I always felt bad for Chris because even though he's the most interesting of the three, he was the one that nobody asked questions of. So they stopped doing it with Chris, but they were still bringing Dwayne and LeBron out of the locker room to podiums, which is very. I mean, you do that for the finals, like you don't, or the Eastern Conference Finals. So we were waiting on that, but the sort of the procedure was you got done, and then 10 minutes after the game, or right after the game, Spo speaks outside the locker room, and then the locker room opens at the same time as Dwayne and LeBron make their way out to the podium, and you always had to make a choice every night. Am I going to go to the locker room, or am I going to get Dwayne and LeBron? And a lot of times you just say, okay, I'll get Dwayne and LeBron off the quote sheets, and I'll work the locker room. So I was there alone, but Mike Wallace was there, my friend from ESPN, and he and I both made it to Spo, and we were like, okay, when is the locker room going to open? And I'm on this ridiculous deadline. They've just gone to Fallen 9-8. They look like trash, all right? The whole thing's falling apart. And I'm waiting for the locker room to open, and the locker room doesn't open. And we're asking Tim Donovan, everybody else associated with the Heat, when's the locker room going to open? Well, I don't know. They're having a meeting. They had a 45-minute meeting that night. Now, we've talked about this a little on our pod on what actually happened. It was actually Dwayne who said, we need to start communicating. Spo was not in the meeting. It was perceived as a mutiny against Spo. It wasn't. It was more a mutiny against themselves. They were kind of like, and not a mutiny, but they were kind of like, this isn't going to work.
Right.
And it was Dwayne who basically said, this isn't going to work. And, there are others, James Jones, others who spoke. But we were waiting. But the thing with Spo was, Mike Wallace was the one who asked him, what happened with LeBron on the court. And Spo acted, and he still, I think, to this day claims that he doesn't realize what happened, that LeBron bumped him. I sort of believe it because Spo gets in this place.
Sure.
Where, he just doesn't realize anything else that's going on.
Every time out he calls, he does that Riley walk to the middle of the
middle
court.
Of the court.
Yeah, exactly.
But I've also had these conversations, and I've known Eric a long time because, when I broke in, first year I covering the Heat was 96. Eric had just started.
Right.
He's 3 years older than me. I would see him out on the road. We were in our 20s, young guys out on the road. He got into places I didn't. He always claims that he got me and Chris Perkins into a party at the All-Star game in Denver in 2005, which is not true, Eric. We got you in. Only thing I remember from that party was at a big house, and I remember Devin Harris. That's all I remember. But I've known him a long time, and so you kind of know when he kind of zones out. And sometimes when you're interviewing him, like when you're interviewing Eric on the side, you'll ask him something, you'll be kind of probing him for something, and then you'll start talking about something else, and 3 minutes later, he'll come back. He'll just start answering the question you asked him 3 or 4 minutes ago. It's like he's processing stuff. He kind of stares into space. It's a very kind of unique way of communicating that way. So does it stun me that he didn't realize that LeBron bumped him? No, I think it's probably likely that somebody, even if he didn't realize it, somebody told him.
Sure, he saw the video afterwards.
Saw the video, or maybe one of the media relations guys said to him, "You're going to get asked about this."
Right.
But he claimed that he didn't know it was happening. But again, they had this meeting, and then right after the meeting, there was the leak to Chris Broussard of ESPN about all the issues LeBron was having with Eric.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that came from Maverick Carter. So we knew it at the time that it was coming from LeBron's camp. So that was a very fragile time.
Sure.
But again, you look at Bumpgate, you look at Crygate. I mean, one of the funny ones was Chillgate. That was when Bosh, after they lost the game, I think they might have won a game on national TV. They won it. But he said, we just want to chill. Eric wants to work. That was a 3-day story.
Yeah.
Then there was Cablegate, which was, they always used to speak at shoot-arounds. And so Bosh spoke at a shoot-around. It was before they played Toronto. And Chris said, he was asked something about watching games. And he says, well, we didn't have the good cable in Toronto. This was the front page of the Globe and Sun or whatever up there. And he's right, by the way. They don't have good cable in Toronto.
You can't get ESPN in Toronto.
No, you can't. Well, you can get
CSN or whatever it's called.
Yeah, but no, they have an ESPN equivalent, but it's all hockey.
Right.
And a little bit of curling.
Right.
Okay. My big issue, on the road in Canada was, trying to get Game of Thrones, because you could not get HBO in the hotels, and this is before pre-HBO Go, so I believe. So you couldn't get it. But that was a story. LeBron made a comment to Brian Windhorst in Phoenix where he said, maybe we should have fewer teams. Like if Kevin Love wasn't stuck in Minnesota, he could be, which was for foreshadowing, I guess. But basically, he made it sound like he wanted to contract half the league. That didn't go over.
Right.
Everything that he said
Under a microscope. Yep.
under a microscope the whole time. I mean, the one who got away with stuff at that time was Dwayne.
Yep.
And that was the big joke because I remember in Toronto, first time Chris went back to Toronto, and Chris was waving his arms up, and basically, and saying, bring it on. He was like a wrestling, heel.
Yep.
And then afterwards, he and LeBron did the press conference together, and they were joking about how Dwayne never gets booed anywhere.
Sure.
That it's always the two of them. And it was with Chris, it was really more he was mocked. With LeBron, it was he was hated.
Dwayne was established. He was the guy that stayed put. People came to join him, and he was already a champion.
Yeah. And so, that was a little bit different. I think, and then it changed again where obviously Dwayne left, came back. And,
right.
And then, got the send-off. Now I feel like Dwayne gets more heat than he ever got when he was playing because of some of the stances he takes.
Right.
But it was just different. It was just, there were so many of these moments. I mean, I'll tell, this one is just a personal funny one, but I was there the night that LeBron James got carded, which is something you would never think
he got carded.
Yeah, so we were in, this was last year of the Big Three because Beasley was there. That's how I know, because he was at it. So they were in a hotel. We don't typically stay in the players' team hotel because usually you just can't afford. Not that we can't, but it's just can't afford them.
Right.
But the only hotel to stay at in downtown Orlando is the Grand Bohemian, which is a Marriott property.
Mm-hmm.
So we stayed there, and I remember it was the night of the Orange Bowl, and so we saw, we were sitting. There's this one bar in the lobby, and Chalmers and Beasley came down, and LeBron came down to join them. So of course there was some company in the area. Company tends to go to the, it wasn't brought; it arrived.
Yeah.
And so we're in this lobby bar, and I'm sitting with Jason Jackson and some others, and just drinking, watching the game. Nothing crazy. Like 10 o'clock on a pregame night, on a night before game. And LeBron went up just to the bar to watch. He wanted to see. It was a small TV, and he wanted to watch the Orange Bowl was going on in Miami, and Ohio State was playing. So that's LeBron's team, one of his teams. And so he's watching, and the girl behind the bartender looks at him and goes, "I'll need to see ID." And he looks. This is 2014.
Yeah.
He looks back at Jackson, me and some others, goes, and we're like, "Show your ID." I think it's because the girls might have not looked of age.
Could be.
So maybe it was making sure you go through
That's
protocol.
right.
But the idea of the most famous athlete in the world who happens to have, who looks maybe 10 years older than he is at times because of the beard, being carded at age 28. But the worst part of it is that, so the next day, I joked to a friend of mine, I'm going to call him out, a sports writer friend of mine, Chandel Richardson, because Chandel had just left before this happened. So I texted him, he said, "You never believe what happened. LeBron just got carded." I said, "What?" So I said, "But don't say anything." So I wasn't going to write about it.
Sure,
He's just a guy enjoying a beer. It's not a big deal. So the next day, like Chandel, we're in the locker room before the game, and Chandel decides to ask LeBron. He says, "I heard you got carded last night." LeBron looks at me like, but it got worse because there's another reporter, a local reporter, who I like, but I won't name in this case, who decided to ask LeBron about it and write about it. So I'm sitting there during this Orlando game, and LeBron got off to a really slow start. Like he started like 1 of 8 from the field. They won the game, but he started like 1 of 8 from the field. And I'm writing, and somehow then USA Today picked it up, and USAToday.com is picking up and says LeBron not playing well, perhaps because he was out partying the night before. He's literally at the same hotel bar that I'm at, drinking a beer, okay, so that he can go upstairs afterwards and do whatever. And plus, they can do what they want the night before a game. And the game was 24 hours later. And so this came out. So after the game, I actually walked up to LeBron and apologized. I said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I shouldn't have said anything to anybody." He's like, "No, that's all right." But it made me feel ridiculous.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. Talked about the stories that you're very fond of looking back on that time. Same question, but focused on individual players. The show's called Lessons Via Leaders, things we learn from other people. Who are some folks that you've covered that you just grown to like really, really respect, and some like lessons that you've learned from them, just watching them do their craft or grow over time?
Well, there's a few kind of larger than life figures who've come through South Florida sports scene. Pretty much covered all of them over the last 20 years. The one that I missed was Shula, because I started covering the Dolphins in '96. But I did interact with him. We did Jason Cole and I did a photo shoot with him, like late '90s, for the cover of the Herald. Or probably, actually, I was at the Herald then, 2000, 2002. So it was early 2000s. So it was after he was out of the mix for a little bit. We did a photo shoot with him, and I just remember that his only concern was that we shot his good side. I thought that jaw could be seen from either side, but so I had some interactions with him. Obviously had a lot of interactions with LeBron, and a lot of individual interactions with LeBron. I kind of, the way that I got in with LeBron was when he first came, his first couple of months, he didn't really interact with local media at all. The thing about LeBron that people don't realize, Jimmy Butler's the same way, by the way. I don't think people realize. He knows he observes everything that's happening.
Very attentive, yeah.
He's very attentive. He knows. Like, I haven't had any one-on-one discussions with Jimmy, but Jimmy knows. And LeBron answers questions differently from certain people than he will. You can ask the same question to somebody else, but if he knows you and he respects you, he will answer it. He will give you a better answer. He's very good at this. People don't recognize that. But the way I got in with him, it really wasn't totally intentional. Was he wrote a book with Buzz Bissinger that he didn't like. Okay, it never really went anywhere. It was called. It had a second title because I think they tried to repackage it to sell it, but I think it was called My Dream Team or something like that. I have it, and I found it on Amazon or something, and it was about him and his own Fab Five from St. Vincent St. Michael's in St. Vincent. I was scripted.
St. Vincent St. Mary.
St. Vincent St. Mary. Yep. In Ohio, in Akron, and so it was about them. And so I read this. I think I was on like a cruise before training camp started, and so I decided to read the book. It took me like 3 days. It was a short book. So I finally got a one-on-one with him in December, and at that point, I really hadn't had any interaction with him individually. And I was told I would get like 10 to 15 minutes. So I wanted to do a story with him about leadership, and it was the first of 2 big pieces on leadership I wrote. I wrote about him. And so he gave me about 10 minutes. And so it was a normal sort of interview, him feeling me out and there's rest. And then he gave me, I said, well, why is it so important to you to win? Why? I mean, he sort of looked at me because that's like sort of an obvious question for an answer, but I wanted him to think about it. Why is it so important for you to win? And he looked around and he says, well, you see Z, and he was looking at Zildjiūnas Ilgauskas, who he'd played with in Cleveland. He pointed at Jabal McGlure, Juwan Howard, Eddie House, who was on the team at the time. Yep. So some of the veteran guys on the team. And he said, I want to win because I'm their best chance. He says, I don't know if they're getting another chance. And I said to him, and we're sort of standing in the middle of the facility, and I said, so it's kind of like what you said in your book. Because one of the things he said in that book was that he wanted to win for his other guys, for Romeo and Travis and some of the other guys that he played with, that he wanted to win for them because this was their best opportunity on the stage. And he looks at me and he goes, can I curse on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
He says, you read that fucking book? And I said, yeah. I said, well, why wouldn't I? He says, well, I don't know. He says, nobody read that fucking book. I said, well, yeah. He says, yeah, that's it. And from there, he answered my questions differently. He just, I guess because you did the homework.
Absolutely.
And so I saw his leadership style kind of evolve. The way he put it to me, we did a story in 2013 where he was talking about empowering Tony Douglas, who'd just come to the team, that he was trying to get Tony to shoot and to feel like when he's on the court with him, you belong. I think for all the criticisms of LeBron's leadership in other places and the passive-aggressive stuff in Cleveland, fit in, fit out, the way he undermined Blatt, I was there for all of that. He wasn't running any of Blatt's plays in practice. Okay, just Blatt would call something, and LeBron would just do something totally different. And finally, David just gave up.
Right.
And David was so arrogant also that it just was never going to work. But for all of the criticism of LeBron as a leader, the reality is he never asked for anybody to be traded here while he was in Miami. That Miami didn't make any trades while he was here.
That's right.
I mean, they dumped Joel Anthony's contract, which LeBron was not happy about. That was the day they gave up 73 points to Washington in the first half because they were so pissed off because it happened at shoot-around that day. And LeBron found out after a nap. They finished at Georgetown. Woj broke the story after their shoot-around, and LeBron woke up to find out that Joel had been traded. And LeBron is very protective of the guys on his team who he feels buy in. And he felt that group bought in, and that nobody, whether it was Mike Miller, Joel Anthony, or anybody, should be parted with. Now, I know there's some dispute about how much he knew about the Mike Miller thing, but he was not happy about Joel. So, but I think the thing that's interesting is, if for all to say is, okay, he fought Spo that first year. Spo sat down with him halfway through the second season and said, "Are you going to let me coach you?" And he let him coach him. And I think he didn't agree with certain things. Playing the 4, he never loved it, even though if you look statistically,
he was a beast at the 4.
He was incredible at the 4. It's where he belonged.
The
because
post monster.
And it was the post, but it was also when you played him at the 4, you could play him with 4 shooters.
Yes, exactly.
Or 3 shooters, but then Chris became a shooter too.
Right.
And so it was, as long as he would do the rebounding.
Yep.
Then the only thing he didn't like was going up against David West for 7-game series.
Right.
And I understood that, but the other stuff he was just ridiculous. But that was basically Eric unlocking him, and he finally gave in to all that. But he never forced anybody out. He made teammates feel part of it. He organized along with Dwayne the Trayvon stuff. They organized together the Harlem Shake. Ray Allen told me when he first got here in 2013-14, I said, "What do you like about it here?" And he said, "You know what I like?" He says, and this never happened in Boston, which I could tell you something. He says, when we're on the road, we have a text string, and when everybody gets up at whatever time on the road, it's where are we all going for breakfast? It was a different environment. That was in 12-13, not 13-14, because Ray was unhappy all of 13-14, but in 12-13. So I think LeBron's leadership style was to kind of bring everybody into the tent. I think, what's happened in other places is he just doesn't have patience anymore for those who don't buy in. And I think that, and also he is smarter than all of his coaches, I believe, except the one he had here. And so I think that, and I think they're on an equal level of intelligence. And so I think that basically he just doesn't suffer fools very well. So that's him. Dwayne's leadership style, evolved. I think that I always talk about, Dwayne, my first real interactions with Dwayne, I covered his rookie season. My favorite photo is me looking like with my mouth open as he's hitting the runner in the lane.
Charlotte, right?
Against New Orleans.
Against New Orleans, right.
New Orleans.
Right.
And you could kind of see it, but he was this young, kind of quiet kid. I remember even his first All-Star game, I was in Denver, and we were in the locker room. And in those days, you used to be able to go in the locker room pregame in the All-Star game. And everybody was around LeBron because it was also his first All-Star game. Because he didn't make the All-Star team as a rookie. And nobody was around Dwayne except me and one other writer. And essentially when we were there, I walked out of the locker room and I said, funny story on this, because Dwayne actually, I said, "What was your favorite moment of this whole weekend?" He says, "Meeting Gabrielle Union." It's 2000.
Wow.
Do the math. But so basically, I came out of the locker room that day and I said, to my guy, I said, I don't really have anything to talk to him about. He was accessible, he was friendly, but there really wasn't anything there. And even, I remember he went to, after the 03-04 season, he got invited along with Lamar. This is after Lamar got traded. Lamar Odom got traded for Shaq, but he got invited to the Jacksonville camp. Larry Brown was the coach. Iverson and Duncan were the stars. That team ended up not doing very well. But Dwayne was sitting alone. Everybody was around Iverson. Everybody was around Duncan. There really wasn't. He wasn't like.
He
fully
seemed like
formed.
a quiet guy.
A quiet kid. He wasn't. When Shaq came, it changed.
Right. Because Shaq said this is Dwayne Wade's team when he came. Remember that was
he
one of the
did
first
well,
things
but
he said.
also the other things. I don't think it necessarily changed in a good way at first. I don't. Dwayne became particularly early on in Shaq's time a little more standoffish, very Hollywood, and all the rest. It's really after he kind of saw through Shaq towards the end, and then suffered through the injuries, the embarrassing 07-08 season that the Heat endured, and then came back as this sort of force of nature in 2008, starting with the Redeem team, where he was the best player on the team, and then kind of the peak of Dwayne's powers to me will always be the 08-09 season where he should have been the MVP, and then the 09-10 season where he finally got tired of it and said in Boston, after Michael Beasley was supposed to be the second best player and Spoke couldn't play him, he was unplayable, and said after that, I I need help.
Right.
I think that, I think then we saw Dwayne's leadership kind of flourish. And what I'll always remember about this, where I realized he was in charge and that LeBron was going to follow his lead, was we were at the Hex Center at UM for the pre-media day presser, and they couldn't do it at the arena because they couldn't do it where they used to do it for whatever reason. They did it there, and it was before they went to training camp up at the military base. And so you had Bosh and LeBron and Dwayne at the podium, and Dwayne was in the middle, and Dwayne was the one with the mic. And LeBron spent the entire time, it's just right in front of me, I was in the first one, tapping his fingers. Looked incredibly uncomfortable. It just was not. Bosh was uncomfortable. Bosh told me on my podcast that the reason he was uncomfortable was because he and LeBron wore the same suit. And Chris couldn't believe they came out for this thing where that is the kind of thing that would go through Chris's mind there. Yeah. They wore the same suit.
I thought that was planned, actually. When you see it, it looks like
it looked like it was not planned. It was not planned. But it was Dwayne who was taking control. It was Dwayne who was sharing the mic, trying to make him comfortable.
Right.
It was Dwayne who tried to take the bullets for LeBron that first year. We were in, I don't know if it was first year or second year, but and whether we were in Brooklyn or New Jersey, because it kind of depends which year it was. But they were about to play the Nets, and they were at a shoot around at a small gym. And I had myself and another reporter had a couple minutes with Dwayne, and I was working on a piece about what a championship would mean to LeBron. And Dwayne gave me the quote. He says, "It means more to me for him than it means for him. I want to win. I want this more badly for him than he wants it for himself."
Kind of similar to what LeBron said earlier.
Correct.
What you mentioned. He wants to win for them.
Correct. And I think that was Dwayne kind of. Now, again, that evolved. And by the end, LeBron, we'll never say it now, but was really kind of tired of Dwayne's in and out of the lineup. Last year was very frustrating for him.
Right.
He'd find out 5 minutes before game time that Tony Douglas was starting at the 2. And in LeBron's mind, it changes everything. And so, there was also frustration that they hadn't done more to fortify that offseason, because they knew that Dwayne had issues, and yet you let Mike Miller walk, and he was kind of the stand-in. And so, and you brought in Bees, and Greg Oden, you know. So, but I think that what we saw with Dwayne was, Dwayne, it's not so much the leadership of his team, because there were frustrations he had with Whiteside. There were frustrations of others who didn't fit what he thought a Heat player should be. But it was really more him growing comfortable in his own skin as a human being, I think, more so than as a basketball player. I think you see the Dwayne Wade now is unrecognizable to me from early on. I mean, he's someone who speaks out on everything, takes stands on everything. I think he empowered LeBron to do that. I don't think LeBron is the same without those years with Dwayne. I just think and I think Ray played into that a little bit too, particularly the last couple of years. I think Ray helped Dwayne find his voice somewhat, but Dwayne helped LeBron find his voice, and I think that's his leadership. I want to get to Riley last, because I think, but I think looking at the Dolphins, some of the Dolphins have had guys who should have been leaders here.
Yep.
But their hearts were not in it. If you look at the 3 people that they've had over the past 20 years, I think Brian Flores, by the way, is the real deal.
Yeah, I do too.
I think they found the guy. Finally. But there are a lot of people who never should have even considered to be the guy, like a Gase, like a Philbin, some of the people they've had. I mean, I love Dave Wannstedt personally, but another one didn't have that kind of. I could tell you some Dave stories. We could be here all day. But I think that if you look at, the people they had who should have been leaders were Jimmy Johnson, Nick Saban, and Bill Parcells.
Right.
And all 3 of them checked out either before they got here, in Parcells' case, or because he came down to play the ponies and play golf.
Right.
Or checked out. Didn't realize they checked out, but kind of did, which was Jimmy's case. I think Jimmy came in here wanting to replicate Dallas. I think he set the stage the first 2 years with 2 excellent drafts, getting guys like Zach and Jason and Pat and Sam and everybody else that they added. And then where it changed for Jimmy was he went, I think as a leader, sports leader, you have to be true to your core beliefs all the time. And I think Pat deviated, and I'll get to that. Pat deviated from that once and paid for it, but was able to recover. Jimmy deviated once and never recovered, which was the decision not to take Randy Moss and to trade down, to do the scared thing, which Jimmy never did. This is a guy who traded, Herschel Walker to build his draft. He's a guy who cut players because they fell asleep at meetings. And yet he did the scared thing. He stayed away from Randy Moss because of his quote-unquote history.
Yeah.
Took John Avery, traded down, took John Avery.
I remember that draft. I remember watching that as a kid. We traded away from that pick. Yeah.
Traded away from the pick. He didn't even want to be in position to make the pick. If he takes Randy Moss there, Jimmy's tenure probably is long. Now, I know, again, his heart wasn't in it after his mom passed. He had the situation, too, with... he was day trading. He cared more about his Yorkie Buttercup, I think, than he cared about the team the last year. He had to be talked into staying. If you remember, they brought Wannstedt in. They flew him in from Naples. That was a weird press conference. They flew him in from Naples to ostensibly coach the team. So that was one. Now, Nick's another story. Okay, the first season he goes 9-7. And it was kind of miraculous. They started 3-7. Gus Frerotte played really well for them.
Gus Frerotte, my
played
goodness.
really well. If you want to play a party game sometime, try to name every Dolphins quarterback since Marino.
Just like a Fiedler. I get
just keep saying Fiedler.
Yeah, Fiedler.
Harrington, Tyler Thigpen,
Oh,
Dante Culpepper. Just go on and on and on.
Pat White.
Well,
For a minute.
was he a quarterback? I'm not sure. Pittsburgh killed him. Never recovered from that. But if you look at what he did the first year, is pretty remarkable, actually. Under the circumstances, it was almost to the point that some of us who didn't really care for him had to say, okay, this is working. He had him pointed in the right direction. They won their last 6. But then the next year, it just collapsed. And really it collapsed because of one decision, which I don't really blame him for, which was the Culpepper Breeze decision. There's a lot of revisionist history about this, but if you remember, Sports Illustrated put the Dolphins on the cover as winning the Super Bowl with Dante Culpepper. That's how good they thought that team was. Remember, Ricky was back.
Chambers.
They had Chambers. That team looked like it had a real chance to do something. And you had, obviously, you still had Jason.
Sure.
You had a veteran defense. You still had Zach.
Yep.
Zach was not as big a Nick fan as
We had a good
Jason
secondary, right?
A pretty good secondary, and he had coached up the secondary. They looked good the last half of the season. And so, this was just, okay, they get the quarterback, and they're good to go. But the way that one was told to me, and then I'll get to my Nick story, was, Nick was told by the doctors that Culpepper had a 75% chance of returning healthy from the knee, and that Breeze had a 25% chance of returning healthy from the shoulder. But the caveat was, if anybody had the mental makeup to get back to closer to full strength from that shoulder injury, it was Drew Brees. And Nick was part of this, didn't want to roll the dice. And if they had, things may have looked different. Now, also, it's very possible that Drew Brees in Miami does not become what he became with Sean Payton in New Orleans.
So much of this is because of system and the right fit.
System. And Miami, I don't know. So many quarterbacks had failed. Yep. You would think if Frerotte played pretty well here, that Drew Brees was better and that he would be better. But you just don't know. But when the quarterback didn't come in and he knew he didn't have anything there, and he knew that Belichick, who, he admires but also, was trying to chase down and was jealous of, had his guy in place, and they were going to keep winning.
Yep.
And then you add to that, Nick's wife hated it here, did not like the multiculturalism of South Florida, even though they were living in Rio Vista, which is close to where I live, which is not as multicultural as Miami, in Fort Lauderdale, but she didn't like it. And so there were all these things that were playing out during that time. There's so many Nick stories behind the scenes that people have told and Dave Hyde's written about, and I don't need to tell all those. But the one interaction that I had with him that I do tell was he had this radio show that he would do at the old Gatsby's in Davie, which obviously Gatsby's is shut down everywhere. Sure. But at the time, Gatsby's was kind of a big deal. And so... And for those who've never been, it was kind of an upscale pool hall.
Yeah, I remember. There was one in Boca.
There's one in Boca. There was one down here. There were like 5 or 6 locations. Right. Pretty good food. They had great egg rolls. I was kind of sad that they went away. But a lot of the Dolphins would host, a lot of the Dolphins players would host their charity events there. O.J. McDuffie used to host his there. Jason Taylor hosted one there. because it was close to the facility. It was nice. It was kind of upscale, and you could dress casual but nice.
Yep.
And so Nick had his radio show, and the way that radio show used to work was it was 1/3 questions from the audience. Like they had like a studio audience, people there to meet him. They had 1/3 questions from a media guest and 1/3 questions from the phones. Well, by that point, nobody was really showing up because the Dolphins in that second year had kind of collapsed. But then additionally, beyond that, nobody was really calling in on the radio. So it kind of fell to the media guests. So anyway, Harvey Green, who at the time, and I'm still friendly with Harvey, but Harvey was the senior, for years, he worked for Steinbrenner, but then he worked for pretty much every Dolphins coach here. He was the media relations guy. And Harvey had been asking me for weeks to come on Nick's radio show as the media guest. I had done it the previous year, but I didn't want to do it again. I was kind of tired of him, tired of the whole thing. I don't really want to do it. So he conned me into doing it. This was like with 3 weeks left in the regular season, this regular season going nowhere. And I was like, okay, fine, Harvey, whatever. It's an hour. I think he used to get a $25 gift certificate to Gatsby's. Like, I'll buy some egg rolls. And so I show up there, and Nick's there, and he greets me and everything else. And, it happened to be the day that my colleague, Dave Hyde, asked Nick about coaching Alabama. That day, I'm not gonna be the Alabama coach. Right. It was that day, and I thought about just not showing up to this thing because it's Nick's show. I'm not gonna ask him on a Dolphin show about going to coach Alabama.
Right.
So the only thing Harvey asked me, he says, "Please don't ask about Alabama." Okay, no problem. But we're sitting next to each other. It also happened to be a day after the Pro Bowlers were announced. And Jason and Zach, I think, had been announced as the Pro Bowlers. And so I thought, okay, this is a softball question. Like, I was out of questions. We're like, nobody cared about this team anymore. And, they weren't making the playoffs. It seemed like Nick might be halfway out the door. So I asked what I thought was the biggest softball question. Yes, I said, other than Zach and Jason. And he and I are sitting like about closer than you and I are. This is pre-social distancing. You didn't social distance from Nick Saban at that point. Sitting like closer, and there's a few people, and his wife is sitting in the first row, like making goo-goo eyes at him the whole time. And so like it's just uncomfortable. So I asked him, I said, Nick, is there anybody Jason and Zach, got honored with the Pro Bowl? Was there anybody else on this team that you think, maybe should have been honored? He proceeds to name everyone down to the equipment managers. And then we go to break. And Harvey comes up to me and goes, Ethan, I want to thank you for asking, respectful questions tonight. And Nick is going out to greet the audience and his wife, but before he does, he spins around. He goes, that's not a good motherfucking question. Now I got to name every motherfucking person on the motherfucking team, or some motherfucker who's listening to me on the motherfucking car right now is going to be motherfucking pissed at me when they motherfucking show up tomorrow. I got to motherfucking deal with this shit now. I got 20 minutes left in this damn show. And I'm like, should I even stay here? My friends were playing poker that night. This was our usual poker night. Should I even stay here? I decided to wait it out and do it. But that night, I wrote a note to Brian Wiedmeyer. May he rest in peace. He was the Dolphins president at the time, and he's since passed of cancer. He went to the Browns afterwards. I wrote a letter to Brian, and I said, I'm not going to make an issue of this. And I wrote it to Harvey too. I said, do not ask me to appear anywhere with that person again in public. Okay, I'll conduct business as usual in the facility and be respectful as journalists, but don't. I said, but don't say anything and don't make an issue of this. Next day, I'm in the locker room, and Neil Gulkis, who now actually runs media relations for Homestead, the Speedway, but he was the number 2 at the Dolphins at the time, comes down and goes, Nick wants to talk to you. And I'm like, I don't really want to. I'm in the locker room. I don't really need to. Next day, they come down. He wants to talk to you. I don't really need to. Third day, Nick really wants to speak to you in his office. So I go up to his office, and he's sitting there, and he's at a table, and he's just sitting there eating a sandwich. He's eating a tuna fish sandwich at a little small little circle table, not at his desk. And I walk in with Harvey. It's just me, him, and Harvey. And I said, and Nick looks at me and goes, you and I have a good relationship, right? I said, yeah, okay. He goes, I mean, I heard you're upset. Like, I didn't mean anything. Like, my wife says that, like, I mean, sometimes I say the wrong thing sometimes, or sometimes something I say comes out wrong. And I just looked at Harvey. I said, what about motherfuck this and motherfuck that did I not understand? And I'm laughing as I say it. And like, he's all right. But here's the funny thing I took out of that story. Yeah. I thought he was staying. And the reason I thought he was staying is because why did he care about what the number 2 columnist at the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, or South Florida Sun-Sentinel, I'm sorry, thought about him if he was leaving for Alabama anyway?
Right.
I think he was just throwing me off the trail. Like, I think the only reason he invited me up there was to make me think he was staying, because 3 days later, he was out the damn door. But that was Nick. And I think when you look at leadership with Nick, I think the lesson to be learned from his experience here is you can't lead everywhere the same way. Mm-hmm. The way he leads it in Tuscaloosa works. It works better than it's worked for any college coach in history. Yep. Now, we can argue whether he's playing by the rules or not, right. But the reality is he is one of the all-time 5 greatest coaches in college football.
Right.
But that style, that my way or the highway, arrogance, Napoleon complex type style, does not work with grown men,
right?
Even if they don't have guaranteed contracts in the NFL, the way that it works in Tuscaloosa, and treating reporters in the way he treated them in East Lansing or Tuscaloosa or Baton Rouge, when you're talking about a place where typically college reporters, and it's changed because the media business has changed, but typically the way college reporters worked was you have the old guy who's been there forever, who's not really going to challenge the coach. He has the coach on his show,
right?
Or you have the young kid
right.
who's who's awestruck and is looking to get ahead.
Right.
Here in Miami, he had mid-career reporters, a little bit, bitter because sports writers are cynical. All right, not going to just take your word for everything, and so I think that's where Nick misstepped. I think he came into this thinking he was going to treat everybody the way he did there, and it was going to work, and it didn't. And I think that's why he failed. I think the reason, and this is a long-winded way to getting, and everybody's failed with the Panthers. They've had leaders, Mike Keenan, others that didn't work out. The Marlins, I think McKeon's style of leadership was just let everybody do what they wanted, and it worked.
Yeah.
He caught lightning in a bottle. Leland's style was a little different, also worked. I think he was the right manager for that team.
He was a fascinating figure.
He was and he was perfect for that team because you had a bunch of grizzled veterans on that team, and he was a grizzled guy, smoking the cigarette. He worked. But the reason that Pat Riley is the best leader in the history of this market, and even though I have not always agreed with him, even though we've had our battles, is because Pat has been smart enough to recognize that the strength of leadership is stability. And Pat has created, with Mickey's go-ahead, Mickey's strength was getting the guy and then letting the guy work.
Right.
Okay.
Giving autonomy.
You're the guy. Do it. The Dolphins have wanted to do that with Parcells, with Saban, and with Jimmy. It didn't work, because their hearts weren't into it or they handled it wrong.
Right.
With Pat came into this with something still he felt to prove. Mm-hmm. He came into this from L.A. and then New York, where in L.A. he was, he was never going to get full credit there because he didn't deserve it. I mean, he did an incredible job, but he was given one of the greatest teams of all time.
Right.
Then he went to New York, and he did build something unique and gritty and completely 180 from more his personality than LA, by the way, but totally 180, resurrecting the John Starkses and the Anthony Masons and creating this team that nobody wanted to play. He tells this story about how in New York, the marketing people came to him with these glossy slogans, and he said this. He wrote a chalk outline on a sheet of paper, and he said, "This is what I want." Chalk outline. Nobody wants to play us. And they created, what was, and if you watch The Last Dance, one of the real truth. They created Detroit 2, basically.
Right.
They just weren't good enough. And then he came here with still something to prove, and then kind of created in some ways the Zoe Timmy team, kind of a facsimile of that Knicks team, but then kept running into that Knicks team. I think what Pat has recognized is, and the reason I think the Heat organization, and people say I'm a cheerleader for them. I don't agree with everything they've done, but I am a cheerleader for the way that they generally operate. I mean, you literally look at a media guide from 1996, and you look now, and the only difference is they all have less hair. They're all still there.
Right. Stability.
Jay Sable is still there. Eric Reed is still there. Tony Fiorentino's still in the organization. Keith Askins did our podcast recently. He's still in the organization. Eric Spoelstra was there then, okay? Ron Rothstein is still there. Like, they're all still there. Like, when they talk about family and you talk about and the Dolphins, like, you don't even know who's been there the last 20 years. Like, the Heat, it's literally the same exact, it's the same ushers. It's the same everything. It's, we're in a transient market, but the Heat are not transient.
So true.
The Heat are permanent.
Yep.
And what he's created there is permanent. And the other thing about him that shows leadership is he will make the bold play almost always. One of the columns that he always gave me a hard time about, because I was wrong, was, he blew up the 2004-2005 team and brought in, Jason Williams and Gary Payton and James Posey and Antoine Walker, and I hated the moves. I was an Eddie Jones stan. Okay, I was probably a little clouded because I had a personal relationship with him, but I didn't like the moves. I didn't think they were going to work.
Right.
But he made those moves. He's always made the bold move. It's always been go after the big guy. The one time he didn't, they paid for it for 2 years, which was 2016 and 17, where he made two major mistakes. The first mistake he made was he let someone else take control of the Dwayne Wade contract negotiations, because I think he was scared off because the year before, he and the late Henry Thomas, Henry's a great guy, and they had great relationship through the years, but they battled in 2015 because there was still some hurt feelings for Dwayne about what had happened before when LeBron left the previous year. Right. And so, they ended up having to get Henry and Pat out of the way and have Mickey and Nick Arison meet with Dwayne directly to work out the 1 year, $20 million contract. But then the year after that, Dwayne was still pissed. And then, so what did they do? They went after Whiteside, who was the total antithesis of, I understand why they did it, because they wanted to retain the asset, but they took care of him and went after Durant, who was a pipe dream, and made Dwayne wait.
Whiteside was a 12:01 decision. That was like,
they had to, because Portland and Dallas were right there, and they had an asset they did not want to lose. And so they did that in 16, and Dwayne was, and people around Dwayne were just apoplectic. They could not understand it, but they also couldn't understand why Pat wouldn't talk to him. And also, Dwayne had, as many people around him, including his wife, told me, Dwayne looked at Pat as the father figure he never had, and then he'd been sort of abandoned, essentially. And I think that's where a lot of the hurt feelings came in. But they made they brought in, so he lets Dwayne walk over essentially no money. I mean, Dwayne ended up making less off the Chicago deal because of taxes. Right. So it really wasn't about that. But then it was, okay, so then they made the right decision in 16 to sign a bunch of guys to 1 year contracts. Dion at $2.7 million, James Johnson, they a lot of make good deals. But then the mistake was the next year. And Tyler Johnson, they paid too much that year, but that was everything I've heard, that was Mickey's call to match. But the next year, the mistake was Pat was stung, I think, because Pat is more sentimental than people think. And he was stung by the way that everybody left the big three teams unhappy and the way that it painted the organization and him personally. So LeBron left unhappy. Ray Allen was miserable his last year. Shane was miserable his last year. And you can see he's back in the organization, but that last year. Mario Chalmers was like, why don't these motherfuckers tell me what they're going to do with me? Okay. Chris Anderson wasn't happy that he was basically shoved to the side and then a luxury tax casualty. Right. James Jones was not happy. Mike Miller was not. They all left unhappy. And Bosh then, through no fault of the Heat, because they handled that situation, I thought, properly, but was unhappy. And so everybody was unhappy. And then the icing on the cake was Dwayne. Okay. So the Heat, which had pitched family and stability, and the house breaks up and everybody's trashing the house, right? I think, Pat acted emotionally. Dion Waiters, put a bunch of stuff on Instagram, and James Johnson said culture a bunch of times, and we're going to take care of these guys. It's the one time that he acted opposite character. Right. And if you look at what's happened now and where they're going, and why I do think he will win a title before he's done, okay, is they've totally gone back to where they were, except they've done it with Pat's philosophy, but with Eric's fingerprints are all over it now, where they didn't used to be, where they're now a developmental organization. And so they have, and my whole frustration with them in 16 and 17, why are you paying guys that you can develop for cheaper? because they've shown they can do that.
Right.
They can find the next Whiteside, the next Tyler Johnson, the next Rodney McGruder, the next Derek Jones Jr., the next now it's Kendrick Nunn, the next Duncan Robinson.
You could make the argument that they're the best developmental organization in the NBA.
Absolutely. The only one close is Toronto right now. But they have done that repeatedly. So why were you paying guys and then paying them for 4 years? And so now you see what they did this year.
Yeah.
Hassan, bye.
Right.
Dion, bye. JJ, bye. Tyler, who they liked, but bye. And the other Tyler Johnson.
Right.
And what have they done? They've got developmental guys, but then they also got the guy who fit the culture in Jimmy. And now they have the guy who's next in terms of, in my view, face of the franchise in Bam.
Yeah.
And so they have done this in a way where they've taken all the lessons that they've learned. And I think they are going to get to the top again. And I think when they do, it's going to be more satisfying because it's not just LeBron James making a decision to come to Miami and, okay, we'll reshape it. This is something that Pat and Andy and all these guys and Adam Simon and Eric have built. Like, they've built this developmental thing, and that is Eric mostly. But Pat has allowed him to do that. And there have been many, many times that Pat and Eric have not seen eye to eye. In some ways, Pat blamed Eric for the big three leaving. There's some stories about that, which I've never fully told. There's a bunch of stuff but I think what's happened is, again, I think the great leaders adjust. They create stability, but they adjust to circumstances to continue that stability. And I think what we see now is I really think the Heat organization is probably better than it's ever been. And the other thing about it is nobody ever leaves. I mean, Adam Simon is being recruited by all over the country to be someone's GM, and he's staying here to be part of an ensemble. Right.
You see guys leave and they come back because they realize once they get to the other side, they realize how good it is here. Like Zoe is a great example. There was the whole issue that he went to the Nets.
Everybody forgets that, right? He's a lifer now, but everybody forgets that.
Oh, there was beef.
There was beef. There was a lot. I mean, I thought at the time, Zoe acted, kind of ungrateful towards Mickey. I mean, if you look at it, remember, Mickey gave him his plane to fly back from the Olympics to see the birth of his child. And then it was right after that all of that happened. And so, but now Zoe is, a lifer again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Shane wasn't thrilled with some things his last year. Shane may end up running the whole thing someday.
And the same thing with Dwayne.
Same thing with Dwayne. Yep. Ray Allen's back in the building. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a role for him at some point if he wants one.
Bosh too, might be.
Bosh also if he wants it. I always felt like there's too many other things that Chris would want to do. But they've created this thing that is really, there are only a handful of organizations in sports. In fact, some of them, the Patriots is totally driven by Belichick, but people don't really come back. I mean, McDaniels came back, but like most of them don't. But in Miami, they all come back. The part of that was, for years, Pat didn't want people to leave. Like Jeff Bizdelik, there's a great story. There's so many of these stories, but like they've created this thing that is different. But I do think that it's more meaningful now even than the Big Three era.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And they like their positioning now. They like that nobody believes in them. And I actually think going up to Orlando, I really think the culture, and I know I sort of that word sometimes I don't love it, but I think what they've created, really positions them well for where they're going to go. So I do think they're going to win big soon, very soon.
Yeah. With Jimmy as the core piece.
With Jimmy and Bam. Yeah.
How do you see, real quick, to move on from the leadership, but I do want to talk about how, because you covered both, the main differences in leadership styles between Pat Riley and Eric Spoelstra. I mean, Eric Spoelstra is a disciple of Pat Riley, but how do they differ and are unique in their own way?
I think that I always said that for early on, I thought Eric was trying to wear Pat's clothes, and they didn't fit quite right. I think that, Eric is much more a descendant of Pat Riley than Stan Van Gundy, obviously. Mm-hmm. It's a much more natural fit. But Eric has as a communicator, they're a little different. Pat is more likely to call somebody out than Eric. Eric can be non-confrontational. I think sometimes I think he's gotten much better at this from what I've heard. But I think during the Big Three era, it was problematic with some veterans because his weakness was perceived to be the communication, because veterans didn't really know where they stood, and there were a lot of unhappy guys. I mean, I've mentioned Miller, James Jones. There were others, Richard, that just weren't happy with the communication style. I think what's happened now that Eric's been able to shape this thing, and there's a certain confidence when Eric speaks now. He'll talk about anything now. There was a time he wouldn't do that. He would talk about it to us on the side, but publicly, no. But he's the second longest tenured coach in the NBA.
And he's regarded now as one of the best coaches in the NBA.
And he knows it. Yeah. And that's a different feeling. You know, when I talked to Eric that first year of the Big Three, I remember talking to him again. It was in Phoenix after a game on the court. And I was asking him how he's holding up. And he said, you know, in 25 years, I'll be able to tell people I coach this team. That was how he processed it. You know, I think he was a little awestruck by the whole experience, you know. But I think now, you know, he knows he's good. And I think that what they've allowed him to build is when you're now building players from the ground up, Duncan Robinson, Kendrick Nunn, Tyler Hero, Bam Adebayo, Derek Jones Jr., it is different than when you're inheriting, you know, people who've played for 4 or 5 coaches like a Mike Miller, James Jones, a Ray Allen, a Rashard Lewis. You know, it's just a different thing. So he's what they know.
Right.
You know, so, and there is a thing like, okay, if he won with LeBron, and I know this gets perceived as a negative sometimes, well, he won, but he had LeBron. But if you won with LeBron, right, if you won with Dwayne, I also think what's helped him is Dwayne's evolution with him. Because if you look at it, you know, they started 2008, 2009, where Eric was assigned to Dwayne just basically to improve his shooting. And then he became the head coach. And that was a tough transition because now you're in charge. Mm-hmm. And Dwayne was his best player, and they weren't always aligned. And then the Big Three era, where, you know, Dwayne went through a period of bad health. I mean, let's be honest, the knees. I mean, and you know, couldn't be counted on the way you could be counted on before. Right. And Eric was trying to transition some leadership to LeBron, and that was challenging while incorporating Bosh. You know, there were bad moments. I mean, people remember the Indiana series. You know, to the second year, not the first of the 3 years they played Indiana playoffs. It was being the 12 playoffs, the second round series. And Windhorst and I were sitting. We used to sit.
That was the Bosh injury one.
Yes,
right?
Yes. So we were sitting courtside because Chris got hurt in game 1.
Right.
And we were courtside but baseline, so we were catty corner from Eric and the team. And Dwayne wasn't getting back on defense. He just was not running back on defense. And, you know, Eric, some of this got caught on camera, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. Okay, not all of it. Dwayne basically went back at Eric, and Udonis, as is the case in every one of these situations, is the one holding someone back. Okay, he held Dwayne back. All right, but Dwayne said something to Eric that I never published, but Brian and I heard. All right, which was very demeaning. Very demeaning. I'm not going to repeat it here, but it was. And if it had gotten out, it would have been the end of it. But instead, Dwayne went to, the reason I didn't report it was we heard it, but it was we were trying to get tape verification of it from ESPN because they had B-roll of it somewhere, but we never really saw it. I think Brian saw it, but I didn't see it because he had the ESPN connection. But we kind of knew how bad it was. But then, if you remember, he went to, they were stuck in Indiana for a few days. And remember, that is because the only thing there was to do in Indiana was The Dictator, the movie with Sacha Baron Cohen, came out. So actually, Shane went to see it, and then I went to see it with Windhorst and Joe Goodman, who was covering the team. With the only other 3 people in the theater were LeBron, Maverick Carter, and Randy Mims. And LeBron spent the entire time, he was in the back row, spent the entire time cackling, the entire time, and then ran up to us after it was over and says, "Wasn't that great?" And we're like, all right, and if you know that movie, there's a scene with Blake Griffin that I wish that scene, if you remember that movie, it's not much to remember, but if there's a scene that Blake Griffin is featured in that movie, and if it had been LeBron, the reaction, I wish it had been LeBron that they'd featured in it. But anyway, there was really nothing to do. So Dwayne went to Indiana, the university, because his old college coach, Tom Crean, was there, and he got his knee drained, and he got his head clear, and he came back, and Dwayne and LeBron had like one of the all-time tears where without Bosh, you know, they basically, I mean, they averaged like, look at the numbers from games 4 through 6 of that series. maybe the best the two of them have ever been together.
Yeah, that was a tense series. That rivalry was pretty heated.
That was very heated. The team did not. I think actually the Heat of all the teams they faced in the playoffs, they liked Indiana the least.
Yeah, that Roy Hibbert gave us problems. I remember.
Don't talk to Chris about Roy Hibbert. He didn't like talking about Roy Hibbert or Kevin Garnett. But I think they hated Indiana more than they hated Boston because they didn't respect Indiana as much as they respected Boston.
Right.
San Antonio was just pure respect.
Of course.
OKC was kind of like, we need to put these guys down.
Right.
Okay. But that team in India, they did not like those guys.
It was after that Eric kind of found his groove, you think, as a coach.
He found his groove. But again, even if you look at it that year, I mean, there's so many instances where Eric could have been blown. Eric always told me, he said, there were 3 times I thought I was going to get fired, and I probably should have been. One was when we got LeBron, that most presidents, team general managers would have replaced him with somebody.
A lot of people thought Riley would just come back.
And in some ways LeBron wanted him to. Then the second one was at 9-8.
Yep.
In Dallas, that he would have been blown out for someone else. And then the third one was after the 11 finals, which were not Spo's fault. They were LeBron's fault. But Spo didn't have a great series either. He was out-coached by Rick Carlisle. He waited till Game 6 to put Rio in as the starting point guard. He was playing the corpse of Mike Bibby.
Right.
There were mistakes that were made during that series, but it wasn't. Ultimately, it's kind of like on the fringes. If LeBron plays like LeBron, they win that series. Dwayne was great.
Yeah.
So and Chris
they almost had Game 2, and if they won that Game 2, who knows?
It would have been totally different. So I think just getting back to, I think Eric's leadership style, as far as Pat's, has evolved as he's grown into his own skin. I think Eric's leadership strength is intelligence. I think his players know he's prepared and know what he's talking about. They may not always agree,
right?
But I think that, and I think the other thing with Eric that I appreciate is innovation.
Yeah.
And he is more of an innovator than Pat was.
Right. He's more open to new things.
Right. Pat would not have done some of the things that Eric did. Now, some of them were by necessity. You don't have Chris Bosh. You're starting Dexter Pittman at center. Okay, you need to do something different. Maybe Shane should play the 4.
Yeah.
But some of it has just been Eric tinkering, and that's why I'm kind of fascinated by what's going to happen in Orlando, because Eric has had 3 or 4 months now to just play with combinations in his head, and he has the healthiest, again, provided the players are okay with COVID, the healthiest roster that he's had the whole year, because they didn't have it, because they had Justice was out, and JJ was out, and Dion was out.
Right.
And now they have Iguodala, and they have Crowder, and they have Hero and Leonard, ostensibly back. So they're a full team.
It'll be interesting to see. And conditioning, Miami Heat culture will play a part of that too. I want to talk about 5 Reasons Sports, because you're CEO and an entrepreneur of this new company, 5 Reasons Sports. I would like to tell the audience a little bit about it, why you started it, and what the ultimate goal is.
Well, I mean, there's, like you said, some things get started out of necessity. So I was out of the business for a bit. I think we started with one podcast, Chris Whittingham and I, and really, it was just kind of to get back in the game, but also to sort of recreate our radio show a little bit.
Yep.
And, so we made it a general interest pod. I kind of refer to it some ways as the Goran Dragic of podcasts, that like we were solid. We're going to get you 17 and maybe 5 assists. Probably weren't going to get you 30 consistently. I think starting a general interest podcast in this day and age, although I thought it was better than our radio show, because I do think podcasts are much better than radio. I don't listen to radio anymore. To me, you want the content when you want it.
Absolutely.
You want the specific content you want. You don't want to deal with 7-minute commercial breaks. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. But I think that, we got to a point where, okay, so we're general interest. So are we competing with ESPN? Who are we competing with? At first I tried to build this out, with a lot of professionals that I worked with, people I'm 47, so kind of my core associates, with credibility. And we got up to 15 podcasts. Now, again, I think a lot of them were really good. I think part of the problem is, again, I was trying to connect them all. And I don't have any experience. I've had to learn sales and marketing on the fly. Obviously, I'm very active on social media. I know how to do Twitter. But, I've had to learn all the other aspects of the business. And so, I think the podcast game for us was kind of tapped out as just podcasts. What I decided to tap into was the first podcast that started with us was 3 Yards Per Carry, which is our Dolphins pod. And I was stunned how quickly it took off. They were out doing us with downloads. And the three guys that are on that pod, are not traditional media. One is Alfredo Arteaga, who, is in development and day trades in Miami Lakes. One is Simon Clancy, who does some podcasting and some media, but worked for BBC in London. And one is Chris Kaufman, who manages like $1 billion as a portfolio manager in Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
But they had built an audience together just by posting on message boards and building Twitter.
Amazing.
And so to me, they're what I call fanalists. They're not just fans, because CK Parrott, this is his nickname, is Chris Kaufman, is literally watching tape of like a guard that may go in the 6th round. He's an encyclopedia. Now, Simon in England has relationships with Aaron Rodgers and lots of scouts around the league. Alfredo just kind of ties the whole thing together for them, but they sort of took off. And so when that happened, what this has kind of evolved into through several changes, and obviously, you deal with personal stuff and you're trying to, is what we are now is more of, I'm running the business myself. Chris Whittingham has moved on to just sort of do soccer and do some other things. But we are kind of we're basically a fanalist group. The wall has been broken down. I think ESPN started this when they were letting, Michael Wilbon root for the Cubs and stuff and the Bulls. But I think the old notion of objectivity in sports media doesn't really exist anymore. We were so hyped about that, but what it did was it created this wall between newspaper writers and radio hosts and fans, where the fans don't really think that they care. And the reality is a lot of the sports media, traditional sports media, don't care, because what do you care about? Well, you care about your newspaper's gone from 22 sports writers to 5. So when are they going to let me go? I mean, I hate to say it, but that is what is on the minds of people that I used to work with. Mm-hmm. And you see the contraction. I mean, we had at one point in the early 2000s, there were like 62 sports writers at the big 3 papers, including the Palm Beach Post. And now I think there are a total of 13. So your resources are being cut. Your travel's being cut. They all did the wrong thing as far as giving away the content for free for so many years. And now they're trying to get people to pay subscriptions. And why are you going to pay a subscription when you can get it anywhere?
Right.
And so it's not going to change. It's not going to get better. And so what happened, though, was as this fractured and social media started, particularly on Twitter, the people who are personally invested in every play of every game, hashtag Heat Twitter, hashtag Fins Twitter, those people built their own audiences. And so, do the people, my former colleagues like Omar Kelly and Ira Windham, do they still matter? Of course they do. They have access to the team. But what I want to do, and they have brands and they have credibility, but what I want to do, and what we've started to do, is take these fanalists and empower them, where then they become, a part of, they have credibility. And so the best example that I use now is Alex Toledo, who's on my podcast, 5 on the Floor.
That's who I see you on the floor with, actually.
Yes,
yeah, that's awesome.
Alex is, I think, 23.
Yep.
I mean, he drives a Lyft, or he did when he could, and he's a student at FIU.
He's a great analyst, by the way.
He's really good.
Yeah.
He's not now in the old days. Okay, Alex would have gotten out of. I went to grad school at Columbia, got out, started covering sports. I was a Dolphins beat writer at 24. Okay, it was a little faster than most, but the reality is that's sort of how you did it. Mm-hmm. Now, there's no jobs.
Right.
There's nowhere to go.
Right.
There's no radio stations are laying off producers that they were paying $7.50 an hour to get there at 3 a.m. There's nowhere to go. Newspapers are not hiring ever again. It's not happening. Right. It's just I hate to say it. I have 3,000 boxes of my store. It's not happening. They're done. They're done. Okay, and particularly in sports, because sports is the most expensive thing to cover. So if you're not generating subscriptions off of it, I mean, we just saw The Athletic, which I'm a subscriber to The Athletic. Yep. The Athletic came in here and hired 6 sports writers, respected, all of whom are my friends, from this market. They've laid off all but 1.
Wow.
They just did this 3 weeks ago. Manny Navarro, who was covering UM, is the only one they kept, and now he's going to cover all sports.
I'm paying for The Athletic also.
I love The Athletic, but Miami was not generating subscriptions, and then you had COVID. And so you have people who I'm trying to bring into my network now. But to get back to it, what we're trying to create is take these fanalists, and then obviously I have had a certain amount of credibility with the teams. And So I got credentialed to the Heat, to the Marlins, to the Dolphins, the Panthers, the Hurricanes, FIU, FAU. So we're credentialed to all those places. But then we got 3 credentials to the Super Bowl. So C.K. Parrott, okay, Chris Kaufman, who manages $1 billion in Tampa, was credentialed through my network to the Super Bowl and provided, in my view, better coverage than anybody else, because he's doing it differently. He's not, and again, this is no disparagement to newspaper writers. I was one for 20 years, but you're told you have to hit this deadline, you have to hit that deadline, you have to write a story this way, you have to be a certain. We don't have any of those rules, and so people can be themselves, and so that's what I want to do is create a network. So now we've got more than 50 contributors. I run everything on DM strings on Twitter. I mean, literally on my phone. This hour and a half we've been here, probably the longest I've ever gone without checking, God knows. But we just communicate that way. Now, am I paying everybody what I want to pay them? No. I mean, everybody's an independent contractor. We're trying to create opportunities and bring in revenue. Right. I would say 95% of the people in my network have day jobs.
Yep.
For me, this is all day, every day, but not for everybody else. But they love it. And that's the difference. Yep. They love it. And it's not getting somebody to do it because they're hanging on. We tend to be pretty young and pretty diverse. We reflect Miami. But Alex is a great example because Alex was doing some stuff for Miami Heat Beat, which was in my network for a while. They decided to leave to go to Blue Wire Podcast, which is a national network. But Alex came in and he just wanted to produce for us, but we started giving him some reps on the pod, and he blends well with what we do. He provides more of an analytical voice. And then he's, the Heat, credentialed him, and now in my view he's asking the best questions of Eric Spoelstra at the press conferences because he's coming from a different place. He's not there for 30 years and kind of just it's the same story every night, and I have to fill this space in my column to put it up on a website. Obviously we need investment. We've got to monetize, and we are starting to do that, but we have a full service website now. So we have the podcasts, but we've kind of focused on 7 or 8 instead of 15. 3 primarily, which are 5 on the floor, which is mine, 3 yards per carry, and 5 rings Canes, because those are the biggest teams here. But then we do have a Spanish platform. We do have a Black sports and culture politics platform. We do have an FAU, FIU platform. We have a fantasy platform. We're building out a gambling platform. But we have the podcast, but we're also going to have the website. We have the website. We built out the YouTube channel. We're trying to build that out more. We're going to do more streaming shows. We built out merchandise. You can see the Tua shirt here. That was our biggest seller. Yeah, thank God they drafted him. And now we have this uptick in South Florida sports where, provided that sports exist, all the teams seem to be on the way up. Even the Marlins all seem to be heading the right direction, where I think we can grow with it. Ultimately, I'd like to take the model to find someone like myself in Tampa, Orlando, or Atlanta. I've had some inquiries from other places, and say find the person who used to be in traditional media but interacts on social and knows who the Nekias Duncan is, who the Alex Toledo is, who the Chris Kaufman is, who the Josh Houts is, because they interact with those people and they know that they've built their own brands. That's where I would like to take this. Timeline, I don't know.
Amazing. No, I think that's great. And I think that's a very fresh perspective on where sports media is heading. Like you said, radio shows, it's just not the same way it was just 5 years ago, right? It's changed so rapidly. So I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I'm fascinated with modern day media companies and how they're built. You're building one from the ground up these days. You produce a ton of content. I mean, all day, I'm admiring just what you're doing on Twitter and all the different shows. How do you personally, as someone at the top of this organization, stay organized, on schedule, all these shows, all these contents, all these clips? How do you do it? Uploading all of them?
I mean, as a sports writer, you deal with a certain amount of disorganization. And so you kind of have to learn to organize things in your head. Like, I have planners and stuff. I don't really use them. It's like I buy them thinking I'm going to do it, and then it lasts 2 days. I mean, we really have done it through Twitter DMs. I have 2 strings, one with 50 people, another with 50 people. Some of them overlap, and I kind of rotate people in there, and I just check, and it's pretty much everything is here. Amazing. I mean, it's not. We have an office, but I haven't been there in 4 or 5 months. Where Seltzer Mayberg Law Firm, one of our earliest sponsors, did a trade deal with me, and they give us some space. But I mean, this is such, everything is so fragmented now. It's all over the place that, you're doing these things digitally. We were talking off air before about how some of my best people are not here. I mean, the Nekias Duncans and the Carolinas. Josh Houts is in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania area. Someone moves, it doesn't really bother me because they're still can contribute to the platform. I just brought in somebody for our Cinco Razones platform, which is kind of the 5 Reasons Spanish equivalent, Martin Bater, who used to work here in Miami for ESPN Deportes, but he went out to work for the Diamondbacks, and they let him go during COVID, so he just wants to keep his content out there. And that's one of the things that I want to do is, not everybody's going to make money with us, but I think it's a way for them to get seen. I don't prevent anybody from working for anybody else. Now, some may prevent them from working for us, but I don't prevent anybody. And organization for me, I live on Twitter. Do I need to delegate more? Yes. Do I need to find the right people to delegate to? Yes. We're pretty much running, like I said, I'm running a podcast. We just went 5 on the floor. We're expanding to 5 days a week because we got to deal with Dash Radio, so we're going to be on their Nothing But Net channel 5 days a week. Well, that means, I've got to produce, I have a producer for that, but I've got to produce almost 5 hours of podcast content a week and run the network and make sure everything's edited on the website so that it's clean and I don't have any major issues.
Are you doing the editing
and
yourself?
The YouTube channel. I take a final look at stuff, but I've gotten to the point where there's 4 or 5 people I trust, and I'll just say just post.
Yep.
But it's all, the idea is to get them all to promote each other.
Sure.
Social promotes the web we can push to the YouTube channel. So that's why, it really is a network. It's a force multiplier concept. And I think that, I wrote a book with Anish Chopra, who was my college roommate at Hopkins, but he also was the first chief technology officer in the country, which is funny to me because Anish couldn't work an iPhone 3, but he was the first. That office still exists. They call it the Office of Innovation. Jared Kushner actually runs it now, believe it or not.
Wow.
But but Clinton. Clinton. Anish worked for Obama, so Obama hired him, and we wrote this book. And we played upon a lot of the concepts. It was of the lean startup.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so we actually had, I always forget his first name, Reese.
Eric Reese.
Eric Reese. Yeah. We interviewed him I interviewed him because I was the ghostwriter of this book. The book's called Innovative State. But one of the things we focused on was force multipliers and everything that can be done with big data and all of that stuff. And so, I've tried to apply, I don't think I've done it intentionally, but I think I've tried to apply all of that stuff. I don't put demands on my group. This is not their primary job. They're not making enough for us. But like the way we work with merch, if you look at this, like I have a designer, Adam Smoot, who is,
Yeah, sure. Follow him on Twitter.
I call him our eccentric genius, but Adam will disappear from me for 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden he'll pop up and he'll say, "Hey, I had an hour. I put 3 new shirt designs on the
awesome.
site." Okay. We're waiting because we work with Printful, a third-party thing, and they're not allowing us to put new shirts on because they've got a backup. But, I'll give this away on the pod. We've got a Tyler Hero shirt, a drip shirt.
Nice.
Smoot's going to he won't listen to this, but if he did, that is just awesome. And a Hammer Don't Hurt Him shirt for Myers Leonard we're going to roll out. And a new UM shirt because we don't have one of those Through the Smoke. So we've got... So I just have a deal with Adam. It's just, we take, I take a third, he takes a third, and whatever podcast is involved, in this case, the 2 shirt, it was 3 words per carry, takes a third. We work out a deal and we go. It's literally, we did that like in 3 minutes.
Very cool.
And that, to me, that's the way I want to operate.
Yep.
I don't want a bureaucracy. I just want to empower people to create on a platform. And maybe this thing goes belly up in 2 years, but I'm committed to it. Like, I don't plan to go back. I had offers to go back to traditional sports media. I don't know why there's a train coming at you.
Yeah.
And now at this point, first one back in is first one back out.
Yep.
So I've taken away the net. Like this is what I've got to do. And for my people, the people who've stuck by me and the people who've invested in this, I really want to make it work for them. And so, that's our plan.
I think you're going to make it happen. I think it's really cool. And I'm going to follow you every step of the way. I'm a fan. I'm a consumer of the content.
Appreciate it.
Last question because I know you got to run. We asked this of everybody that comes on the show. Lessons via leaders. Looking back on your career, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've personally learned? That you kind of wish you told yourself when you first got going in journalism.
Some
media?
of these I can't talk about because I got non-disclosure.
Sure.
From a work perspective, I'll stay there. From a work perspective, I think it's a lesson I would tell myself is allow yourself to be more bold. I was told years and years ago, before there were some other issues that got involved, to go off and do my own thing, and so it became a cause of necessity. But I think if I could, I think you have to make the bold moves. Every mistake that I've made as a journalist has been playing safe. I can't tell you how many stories I could have broken, but I didn't want to irritate this source or do this, or I didn't want to be wrong. And typically what we've seen in this business, and I'm not saying all the right people have been elevated, because they have not been. But I think what we've seen in this business is that, the risk takers are paid off, and the loudest voices do get noticed the most. I think it's very rare when you can have someone with the credibility and intelligence and creativity of Dan Le Batard, who also, happened to rise to that level. I think Dan is an example of someone who's stuck 95% of the way to his principles and his beliefs. He was a great mentor to me, and to others who've made it, and still got all the way. It's very hard to do that. It's much easier to be the shock jock or to be that kind of thing, and that's not him. Although people outside of Miami think it is, it's not. So I think that if I could teach myself something, it would be to take more risk, and all the rest of that. I mean, as far as the way I'm trying to lead this quote unquote company, I don't even think of it as leading. I just think of it as, we're going to have fun today and create content. I want to create an atmosphere that's fun. My last few years at newspapers were not fun. They just weren't fun. And it wasn't the fault of the editors or anything. It was the fault of the corporations above them. They made everybody pay for their mistakes. They didn't respect the internet. I always go back, I went to Columbia for 1 year for graduate school. It's just a 9-month program. So I was there for 1 year. I went in 1995. I was 21. So I got out at 22. And the way that the internet was just kind of starting in a big way, and the way Columbia acted at the time, it was like, ignore it. Mm-hmm. You're going to leave here, you're going to get a corner office at the New York Times. And it's just like the arrogance of mainstream media.
Yep.
And then when it all blew up, then they made the people working 100 hours a week pay for it with furloughs, with taking away any perk, any reason you got into this business, and it's just holding on for dear life, and then lying to you, having these meetings and telling you, well, we're going to reshape this. No, you're not. You're just cutting. And you see what's going to happen at the Herald now, which, I don't have warm regards for certain things that happen with me at the Herald, but I do still care about some people who are in the building. I mean, they're going to get bought by a hedge fund, and this hedge fund is going to keep them alive, as a corpse. They're basically going to, they'll just trim until there's nothing left to trim. And I think that's unfortunate. I think some of it was out of the control of these companies, and, technology and everything, advancements happen. But I just think the level of arrogance did not allow them to adjust. With this company, I'm going to adjust. If we have to do something, I didn't plan on doing a YouTube channel. We were doing podcasts. Okay, that's going to work. We're going to go with that. All right. And I just want to have fun. And I do think we can create a concept that also, the biggest thing I want to do is I want to make the community part of it. A lot of the people I've brought in over the past month have been people who just showed up at our watch parties.
Right. Just listeners.
They were listeners.
Yeah.
They're not even the fanalists I was bringing in before.
Right.
Who I actually sought out, those people interacted. These are just people who follow 5 Reasons.
Right. That's awesome, man.
And so that's the way I want to do things.
Go big, go home, and have fun doing it, right?
I hope.
I love it. Where can folks find you? 5reasonsports.com.
Everywhere,
Twitter, Instagram.
5reasonsports.com. Got to spell that out.
Yeah.
At 5reasonsports is the number 5. We've got a bunch of other Twitter accounts, but basically if you follow at 5reasonsports, you'll find us. And then obviously the YouTube channel, I really do recommend, because we got a lot of people creating content from scratch there. And we're going to be posting a ton of stuff. We've gotten access to the NBA Content Network and to all the Zoom calls. So we're going to have everything there. And we will produce, I don't know if it'll be better content, but we will produce more content than all the other outlets here combined. I just have more people.
Yeah.
And so it's not about me. It's just about them.
Awesome, man. Well, you're doing great stuff. I encourage everybody listening to check out Ethan. 5 Reasons Sports. Also, you could find him on Instagram, Twitter, at Ethan Skolnick, right?
Yeah, EJ Skolnick is Instagram is just my daughter, basically. So this is his shirt, yeah.
That's awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Will.